The ultimatum wasn't the problem. It was the way the human received it. Ambassador Elena Vasquez stood at the center of the council's grand chamber, surrounded by 73 species who had collectively governed this galaxy for 10,000 years. And she smiled, not the brittle, apologetic smile of someone accepting a verdict. Something else. Something the Zentari observer Halvin Riss could not immediately classify. The chamber's atmospheric sensors, tuned to detect stress hormones and over 200 known biochemistries, registered almost nothing from her. No elevated cortisol analog. No shift in respiration. Her hands, folded loosely in front of her, did not move once during the entire reading of the ultimatum. Halvin Riss had been observing humans for 11 years. He still did not understand them. And standing in that chamber, watching Vasquez's stillness while the Vorthak ambassador informed her species that it had 48 hours to surrender its fleets or be treated as hostile, Halvin realized, for the first time in a long career built on the assumption that patterns eventually resolve into understanding, that he was afraid of what he could not read. The Council's fleet reduction directive had been drafted in secret and passed by a 2/3 majority 9 days earlier. 9 days, which meant even the delegations that had once called themselves humanity's allies had voted for it, or at least declined to vote against it, which in the Council's language amounted to the same thing. The logic. To every species that processed logic the way logic was meant to be processed in that chamber, was unassailable. Humanity had arrived on the galactic stage barely 200 years ago. In that time it had assembled a defense apparatus that, by every metric the Council's own analysts could produce, outpaced its documented industrial capacity by a margin the Zentari Institute for Comparative Threat Assessment had privately described, in a report almost no one had read, as not mathematically coherent. They were young. They were fast. They did not behave the way new species were supposed to behave. The resolution itself was simple, almost generous in its wording. Humanity would surrender its registered war fleet to Council custody, retain a small unarmed diplomatic escort, and submit to a 20-year observation period during which its remaining industrial output would be monitored by a joint Council commission. In exchange, humanity would receive full trade access, technological subsidy, and a permanent seat on 4 minor councils. Vasquez agreed to the terms within 6 hours of receiving them. Not 6 days. 6 hours. The Vorthak ambassador, a severe and ancient administrator named Threlker Vaughn, had told the chamber, and the assembled delegates had not applauded. Applause was considered undignified among the older species. But the relief that moved through the room afterward had been almost a physical thing, a loosening in 73 sets of shoulders at once. Halvin Riss had watched that too. He had written, in the report nobody read, the human ambassador accepted without counter-negotiation. This is statistically anomalous. Flag for review. Nobody flagged it for review. He asked his junior analyst, a young Keth researcher named Farron. 3 days later, standing in the observation gallery above the transfer docks where the first human vessels were being logged into Council custody, why they had agreed so quickly. The terms were generous, Farron said. The trade access alone justifies it. Halvin watched the human maintenance crew disembark from a decommissioned frigate below. 2 of them were laughing about something. One shoved the other, lightly in the shoulder, and they both nearly fell over laughing harder. Pull the negotiation transcript again. Halvin said, not the words, the timing. Farron was quiet for a while, running the audio through a pause analysis filter that had never once been necessary for a human delegation before, because human delegations always had pauses, always hedged, always asked for time. Their pauses are absent, Farron said eventually. There aren't any. They accepted a 300-page resolution in under 6 hours, Halvin said. Either they didn't read it, or they'd already read something we never sent them. I don't understand the distinction. Neither do I, Halvin said. That's what worries me. The transfer took 7 months. Every human vessel arrived exactly on schedule, crew manifest verified, weapon systems confirmed inert by inspection teams using sensors sensitive enough to detect a concealed sidearm from 40 meters. They found nothing they hadn't been told to expect. The ships were, by every measurable standard, clean, except for one detail that the inspection teams noted, logged, and collectively decided was not worth escalating: the fuel reserves. Every transferred vessel arrived with full reserves. Not the partial load you'd expect from ships being pulled permanently out of active service. Not the minimum transit allowance standard for a vessel headed into long-term storage. Full, as though every ship had been freshly resupplied the week before handover. The Council's chief logistics officer, a meticulous Tizar administrator named Korvax Delm, wrote in his clearance assessment, "Human operational doctrine likely mandates full reserve maintenance as a matter of internal regulation. No security implication identified." Halvin found the note 6 weeks later, cross-referencing an unrelated file at 3 a.m, because he had stopped being able to sleep through a full night sometime around the 4th month of the transfer. He read it 4 times. Then he opened a new report and got 2 paragraphs into it before his supervisor called and told him, not unkindly, to stop spending Institute resources reopening a case that the full council considered closed and, more importantly, considered good news. He stopped writing the report. He did not stop thinking about it. The celebration held at the council's next general session was the largest diplomatic gathering in over a century. Ambassador Vaughn delivered a speech that ran nearly 2 hours and used the phrase "a new era of galactic stability" no fewer than 9 times. Vasquez sat in the human observation gallery and listened to the entire thing without moving. She wore the plain gray of her delegation's formal uniform. No medals, no aides beside her, in a gallery built to seat 40. Halvin watched her through the security feed for most of the speech. She never looked bored. She never looked relieved. She looked. And this was the part he could not translate into any of the 6 languages he spoke fluently, like someone listening to an enemy deliver a eulogy at their own funeral and finding it, privately, almost unbearably funny. He flagged the footage and sent it to 2 colleagues. Neither responded. A third wrote back, "You've been studying the species for too long, Halvin. You are finding shapes in static." Maybe, he thought, maybe, but he kept the footage anyway. In the private archive, he had begun keeping without quite admitting to himself why. The first sign that something had gone wrong came 4 months after the transfer was declared complete, and it came from the least dramatic place imaginable, a routine cross-check of the Terran Civilian Shipping Registry, run by a board trade monitoring station in the outer relay corridor. The check flagged an anomaly. Registered human civilian freighters had increased by roughly 11% in the 14 months since the resolution had passed. Not unusual on its own. Trade access had improved, but the new vessels clustered almost entirely in one very specific tonnage class. The exact tonnage class of a human frigate, with its weapon housing stripped out. Coincidence, Korvax Delm said, when Halvin finally got a meeting. Trade expansion. Nothing more. 390 vessels, Halvin said. Civilian construction at that scale, in 14 months, exceeds documented human shipyard capacity by a factor of roughly 6. They don't build that fast. They never have. Korvax looked at the data sheet for a long time without saying anything. These weren't built, Halvin said quietly. They were reclassified. The council convened a closed investigation 3 days after Halvin's report was formally submitted, which meant it had already sat, quietly suppressed, for 11 days before someone with the authority to be frightened finally forwarded it upward. 7 species. No human delegates. No notice to the Terran mission. The question on the table: had humanity technically violated the fleet reduction directive by maintaining a functional military under civilian registration? The answer took 2 days to arrive, and it was not the one anyone in that room wanted. "They have not violated the resolution," said the lead investigator, a careful Zentari jurist named Osha Threll at the closed session. Her voice had the particular evenness of someone choosing every word with great deliberation. The directive required the surrender of the registered Terran fleet and the disarmament of classified military craft. These vessels were reclassified before the resolution took legal effect. They were, in the strict sense, never part of the fleet that was surrendered. They changed the registration of their warships, the Tizar delegate said, too loudly. They changed the registration of vessels which, at the moment of reclassification, carried no active weapon systems. Osha said, a pause, longer than the first. The weapons had already been removed. Removed to where? Another pause, longer still. We don't know. Halvin, reading the transcript he was not technically clear to see, stopped at that line and read it 3 more times. Then he pulled a private file he'd been quietly assembling for 7 months, long before this investigation had even been convened. A file tracking human logistics activity in the 18 months preceding the vote. There had been an unexplained surge of freight movement at 3 salvage facilities in the asteroid belts beyond the Terran system's outer edge. The activity pattern matched large-scale, long-term storage. The weapons had not been hidden after the disarmament. They had been hidden before anyone outside humanity's own government had known the disarmament was coming. Halvin sat with that for a long time. Humanity had known. Somehow, they had known the resolution was coming before it was drafted, possibly before the Council itself had consciously decided to pursue it. And in the space between knowing and the vote, they had quietly, legally, with surgical precision, separated their weapons from their ships and reclassified the ships as civilian craft, all while presenting a posture of total, grateful cooperation. He thought about Vasquez's stillness when the ultimatum was read. He thought about the full fuel reserves. He thought about her sitting alone in the gallery, listening to a victory speech about her own species' defeat. Everything I believed I understood, he wrote in his private file, was only ever the surface. He requested an urgent meeting with Council Secretary Orwin Kale. It was granted within 4 hours, which told Halvin that Kale was already afraid. They didn't disarm, Halvin said, before the door had fully closed behind him. They reorganized. Everything we accepted was technically compliant and operationally meaningless. The ships have no weapons. The ships know exactly what the weapons are. He placed a second file on the desk. I've modeled the logistics chain backward from energy signatures and supply runs at the storage sites. There's enough payload there to fully rearm approximately 1,900 vessels. The reclassified civilian fleet numbers just over 2,300. They're short, Kale said. His pale-fur was doing something involuntary at the edges of his hands. You're saying they can't fully rearm. I'm saying I can account for weapons for 1,900 of their ships. Halvin kept his voice level, because he had practiced in the mirror that morning, aware of how unsteady it wanted to be. I could not account for the other 400. Silence. The transferred vessels, Kale said slowly, were delivered with full fuel reserves. Clean weapon scans, Halvin said. Perfect compliance. And I haven't slept properly in 3 weeks, because I can't determine what those reserves were for, since those ships weren't scheduled to go anywhere except our custody. He looked at the secretary directly. Unless they were being kept ready to go somewhere from our custody. Kale stood and walked to a window. Below, the Council station held its full complement of surrendered human warships, gleaming and silent and empty in the dock, a monument to a peace that had cost humanity, on paper, everything. They wouldn't, Kale said, but something had already gone out of his voice. Tell me why not, Halvin said. Give me the real reason, not the diplomatic one. Kale didn't answer. The Council sent a formal inquiry to the Terran mission the following morning, worded with the careful blandness of a routine audit. Vasquez responded within 4 hours. Her reply was 2 sentences. The Terran government is pleased to cooperate with any audit of its civilian shipping registries. We would suggest this conversation also include Fleet Commander Chun, who is currently in residence aboard the Council station. Chun had been on the station for 6 weeks, listed in the public registry as a civilian technical advisor, aboard the very station that housed humanity's surrendered fleet. Halvin read the response and felt something for which his language had no exact word. The closest translation was something like, "The moment you understand the trap has always been there, and the sound you heard earlier wasn't a trap being set. It was a trap quietly, finally closing." He called Farron. "Give me everything on what Chun has been doing for 6 weeks. Technical advisory sessions." Farron said after a moment, with the maintenance teams assigned to the transferred vessels. Doing what specifically? A pause. Helping them understand the ship systems. Maintenance protocols. Emergency power routing. Engine restart sequences. The silence between them lasted 4 full seconds. "She's been teaching Council crews," Halvin said slowly, "how to operate human warships. That's cooperation. That's helpful." Or, Halvin said, "She's been making sure that when those ships move again, they move correctly, under whoever is actually authorized to move them. And the council crews aren't the ones she's been training for that. His voice dropped. Pull the access logs. Every individual who's boarded those vessels in the last 6 weeks. Cross-reference against the Terran Civilian Registry. Another pause, much longer this time. There are approximately 800 names on both lists, Farron said quietly. 800 human naval veterans, officially listed as civilian contractors, who had spent 6 weeks relearning the emergency systems of ships they used to command. Halvin closed the comm and sat alone in the dark of his office, feeling something press against the inside of his chest that had nothing to do with fear of an enemy and everything to do with the specific vertigo of realizing you have been reading the wrong book the entire time. Humanity had not lost this negotiation. Humanity had not even been playing the negotiation the Council believed it was playing. While the Council spent 14 months congratulating itself on having neutralized the most dangerous new species to enter galactic society in 2 centuries, humanity had been doing something else entirely. Something that looked, from every official angle, exactly like surrender. They had been waiting, not helplessly, the way something waits when it has already finished everything it needs to do and now requires only the correct moment. He needed one more thing before he took this to the full Council. One thing that would tell him whether this was insight or 11 years of professional obsession finally curdling into paranoia. He pulled the maintenance logs Council crews had filed during Chen's advisory sessions and found what he was looking for on the 3rd page. Every transferred vessel had been run, at some point in the last 6 weeks, through what the logs described as a routine emergency power systems diagnostic, a procedure that, on a human warship, required bringing the engines to 60% output and holding them there for 4 minutes. 400 vessels. Every one of them, engines warm, fuel full, crewed in principle by people who still knew exactly how to fly them. Halvin stood, walked to the door, walked back, and opened a direct channel to Kale. "We need to talk to them," he said. "Not another inquiry. A conversation. With Chun. And we need to ask the right question." "What's the right question?" He thought about it for a moment longer than felt comfortable. "We need to ask them what they actually want." The meeting was held in the Council's full primary chamber, not a side room, because Kale wanted Vasquez to feel the weight of 73 SEALs looking down at her. Halvin, watching Chin settle unhurried into her chair across the long table, suspected the choice amused her more than it intimidated her. "I'm a civilian now," Chin said pleasantly, before Kale had finished his opening line. "Technical advisor." "Fleet Commander Chun," Kale said, his voice steadier than his fur. "We would like to discuss the current status of the transferred vessels." "Of course." She folded her hands on the table. "Which aspect concerns you?" Halvin leaned forward before Kale could answer. "All of it," he said. "But specifically, why are the engines warm?" Chin looked at him directly, and for the first time in 11 years of studying her species from behind glass and data feeds, Halvin had the distinct sensation of being seen, not as an analyst, not as an obstacle, but as the one person in the room who had finally asked the question that mattered. "Because," she said, and her honesty was somehow more unsettling than any evasion could have been, "ships that sit cold for 20 years don't fly the same as ships that were kept ready." "Ready for what purpose?" She smiled, not the smile from the disarmament chamber. A smaller one, almost tired. 14 months ago, she said, the Drevik Combine began repositioning military assets along the Kessa border. Not all at once. Slowly, in a pattern your own analysts would have recognized as staging, if anyone had been looking at it from the correct angle. She paused. "We've been watching them for 11 months. We believe the fleet reduction directive was, in part, engineered by Drevik diplomatic pressure, specifically to remove the one force in this region their own intelligence assessed as capable of responding effectively to their expansion." Dead silence. "You're alleging," Kale said carefully, "that the directive was manufactured." "I'm saying we complied with it," Chin said. "Not because we were outmaneuvered. Because we needed you to believe we were neutralized while we confirmed whether our intelligence was accurate." She set a single data chip on the table. "It was..." Nobody moved. "The Drevik fleet crossed the outer Kessa boundary 6 hours ago," she said. "In strength." Halvin looked at the chip, then at her. "How long have you had this information?" "For days." "You waited 4 days." "We needed to be certain." She held his eyes without flinching. And we needed the council to ask us the right question, instead of simply ordering us to stand down. If you'd ordered it, we would have had to refuse, and this would have been a very different conversation. A beat, but you asked. You did, Halvin said quietly. Kale reached for the chip with a hand that wasn't entirely steady and read the figures on it twice. This makes a directive. You don't need to suspend it, Chin said. We're still fully in compliance. Those are civilian vessels. Their crews are contracted technical personnel. The small, tired smile returned. If you require civilian assets to perform emergency logistics operations during a border crisis, I imagine that falls well within your authority to request. The chamber understood all at once. Not the relieved kind of understanding, but the other kind, the kind where you trace the last 14 months backward, step by step, and every step you retrace makes the next one more unbearable to look at directly. You built this, Halvin said, not an accusation. Something closer to awe he hadn't asked for and didn't want. From the moment the directive was proposed, you built a compliant structure that could be reversed without violating a single clause. We built a structure, Chin said, that gave the council options it didn't know it had. For our benefit, Kale said, and something complicated moved through his voice. For everyone's benefit, she said. We have colonies near the Kessa border, too. She stood. I'll need your emergency logistics authorization within the next 40 minutes, or the fuel margin stops matching. She walked to the door and stopped, one hand on the frame, without turning around. For what it's worth, she said, we never wanted a confrontation with this council. We wanted you to see us clearly enough to stop being afraid of us. A pause. We're still waiting for that part. Then she was gone, and 73 species sat in a chamber built to represent 10,000 years of galactic governance, looking at a data chip left behind by a woman who had reclassified a war fleet as a shipping company and kept it fueled and crewed and warm for over a year in anticipation of a crisis the Council's entire intelligence apparatus had failed to see coming. The authorization was granted with 6 minutes to spare. Somewhere in the docking bays below the station, engines that had been idling at maintenance thresholds spun up to full output, and 400 vessels the Council had believed were monuments to humanity's surrender began, quietly, to move. Halvin watched them go from the same observation gallery where he had once watched the human maintenance crew disembark, laughing, shoving each other's shoulders. He understood now, finally, what that laughter had actually been. Not nerves, not the dark humor of soldiers giving up their weapons. It had been the laughter of people who knew every piece was exactly where it needed to be. The kind of laugh that only arrives freely once something that demanded total commitment and years of silence has finally reached the moment it was built for. His comm chimed. Farron, the Drevik fleet is holding position, she said. They picked up the transit signatures on the reclassified vessels. They're withdrawing. No engagement? No shots fired. Of course not, Halvin said, because the Drevik had moved against the border they had been told, by intelligence humanity, had quietly allowed to look credible, was undefended, and rational actors, confronted with a force that shouldn't exist, do not fight. They recalculate. A fleet that shouldn't exist. A civilization that had formally surrendered its military capacity and then, through no violation anyone could name, simply hadn't. Not through deception, exactly. Through an act of extraordinary patience and extraordinary precision that had looked, for 14 months, indistinguishable from genuine defeat. Farron, he said, pull the original threat assessment. The one filed when humanity first made contact. A long pause. I'll need to dig for it. He already had it open. He had been reading old files all week, assembling the shape of something he had felt long before he could see it. The assessment, 200 years old, had been written by an analyst who was by now long dead, who had spent 2 years studying the species before producing a document that had eventually shaped 6 separate council containment policies and, indirectly, the Fleet Reduction Directive itself. The recommendation, on the final page, read, Humanity's primary threat characteristic is not technological pace or military capacity. It is a demonstrated willingness to accept enormous individual and collective costs in service of long-term objectives that are not immediately legible to outside observers. Recommend treating any human compliance or concession as potentially instrumental until the underlying objective has been identified. The original analyst had flagged this as a primary finding. The Council had filed it under secondary strategic notes. Halvin read it twice, then looked back out the window at the departure trails of 400 civilian vessels that had just saved a border system without firing a single weapon, that had converted an entire year of apparent vulnerability into a position of total readiness, and had let the Council believe it held power over them for exactly as long as that belief remained useful to keep the alliance intact. He thought about Chen's last words. We're still waiting for that part, for the Council to stop being afraid of them, to see them clearly. He thought, now that he had finally glimpsed it, about what seeing them clearly actually meant, not the version of clarity that produces fear. They are dangerous. Full-stop clarity that had driven 73 species to a near-unanimous disarmament vote. Something else. They had not hidden their fleet to protect themselves from the Council. They had hidden it to protect the Council from a threat the Council hadn't seen coming, while carefully preserving the very diplomatic relationship the Council needed in order to remain functional. They had accepted the humiliation of a symbolic surrender, and it had been a humiliation. He understood that now. Understood precisely what it must have cost Vasquez to sit motionless in that gallery for 2 hours, understood what it must have cost Chun to place that ceremonial weapon down without her hands ever once shaking, because the alternative was a confrontation that would have fractured an alliance they needed intact to face the real danger. They had been patient with the Council's fear. They had worked around it. They had protected the very people who had tried to disarm them. That was the thing he'd had no word for. That was what he had seen in Vasquez's face during the victory speech. Not contempt, not amusement, something closer to sorrow. The specific sorrow of someone who understands they're being fundamentally misread and cannot correct it without unmaking the person doing the misreading. His calm chimed again. A senior Council security officer he had never spoken to directly. The secretary wants a full debrief, the officer said. Everything you know about how they did this. Everything I know, Halvin said, isn't enough. I know the mechanism. I don't know the decision. What decision? He watched the last departure trail fade from the window. The decision to actually comply, to surrender the fleet, at least formally, in a way that left him exposed for over a year on the chance we'd ask the right question at the right moment. He paused. They couldn't have been certain we would. There was a period, months, where the Drevik had moved faster. They'd have had no authorization from us at all. They had been deploying an unsanctioned fleet into a live border crisis, without Council backing, which would have destroyed this relationship permanently. The officer was quiet for a long moment. They took that risk for us, while we congratulated ourselves for having contained them. Tell the secretary exactly that. Halvin said. And tell him the 200-year-old threat assessment is still the most accurate document this institute has ever produced about the species, and we have filed it under secondary notes for 2 centuries. He closed the comm and stayed at the window long after the docks had gone quiet, thinking about fuel reserves, about ships delivered clean and warm and ready under the nose of the most sophisticated inspection regime the galaxy had ever built, about contractors who were veterans, trained by a commander who was listed, on paper, as a civilian, for a crisis the Council hadn't known was coming, about the precision of the timing and how long the patience underneath it must have run, and how many humans must have known and kept a secret and shown up for their maintenance shifts and their advisory sessions and their civilian registry paperwork, living quietly inside the shape of defeat that was never actually a defeat, waiting without complaint for the day the plan became necessary. He didn't know how you built a culture capable of that. How you raise people who could accept the appearance of total loss, perform it convincingly for over a year, and never once break or leak or flinch, because they trusted all the way down that the long game was being run correctly by people they'd never even see. He had spent 11 years studying humans, and he did not have an answer. He suspected he would spend the rest of his career looking for one. 3 days later, the official Council report on the Kessa border incident circulated to the full chamber. It described a border confrontation resolved without casualties through rapid civilian logistic support. It mentioned human cooperation. It did not mention fuel reserves or engine diagnostics or a 200-year-old threat assessment filed under secondary notes, or the exact expression on an ambassador's face, while she listened to a eulogy for her own species' military. Those details went into Halvin's private archive, along with one paragraph that appeared in no official record anywhere, written in his own shorthand, in the section of his research files built to outlast his career. They did not deceive us. They complied with every term as written, and the terms as written were insufficient. We wrote those terms assuming compliance meant surrender, because surrender is what compliance has meant for every other species this council has ever governed. We were warned 200 years ago that this assumption would fail with this one. We did not listen, because we could not imagine a species that would choose the appearance of total defeat as a deliberate instrument, at genuine cost with genuine patience, in service of an objective we could not yet see. The council ordered them to disarm. What we fail to understand is that disarmed is not the same as unarmed, that a weapon placed on a plinth is not a weapon surrendered, that a fleet without visible guns is not a fleet without purpose, and that the most dangerous thing about this species was never what they were willing to do. It was how long they were willing to wait before they did it. He saved the file. He closed the terminal. He walked out into the corridor and past a small group of Terran diplomatic staff moving the other way. Civilians, officially, every one of them. One of them caught his eye and gave a small, unhurried nod. The particular nod humans reserved for someone who had finally understood something they'd been waiting a long time for you to see. He nodded back. He walked the rest of the way to the secretary's office, thinking that the galaxy had spent 10,000 years building systems to manage power, contain ambition, and keep any single species from ever becoming too much of a threat to the rest. And somewhere in the dark between the rocks of a system most of the council had never bothered to name, in salvage yards that had never once been salvage yards, the weapons were waiting again, fueled, maintained, ready, not because humanity wanted a war, because humanity had learned, somewhere in the long wait of its own history, that the ones who survive are never the ones who were strongest in the room. They are the ones who were still standing there, patient and unhurried, long after everyone else had already decided it was over.